Welcome to Pages to Dialogues, your premier destination for insightful discussions on Christian books. Join me as we delve into the pages of thought-provoking Christian literature and explore the timeless truths and principles that can transform our lives. From classic devotionals to contemporary bestsellers, we'll engage in meaningful dialogues that will inspire, encourage, and challenge you to grow deeper in your faith. So, subscribe to Pages to Dialogues now and join the conversation. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you can stay updated on new episodes and exclusive content. Let's turn pages into conversations that matter.
All right, let's dive into this really fascinating source we've got today.
Yeah, it's a cycle of poems. John Piper wrote them, and they're beautifully illustrated by Corey Godby.
And they take a really unique look at the story of Ruth.
Absolutely. And the framing is, I think, what makes it so compelling.
How so?
Well, it's told through the eyes of Obed, Ruth's son. He's an old man talking to his young grandson.
Not just any grandson, right?
No, exactly. David, the future king of Israel. So you get this incredibly personal, sort of intergenerational window into a story many people think they know.
It really does give it a different feel, and the source material, it drops us right into the scene. Naomi is returning to Bethlehem, just crushed by loss. Everything feels, well, utterly bleak.
Right. But woven into that despair, the poems immediately promise something else, a ray of divine hope, piercing through what they call these dark clouds of providence.
That tension, yeah, between the hardship, the human experience, and this underlying idea of God's plan, his providence, working through it all.
That's key. The source really wants us to see that contrast.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive then is to really unpack this poetic narrative. We want to follow that journey, from the deep hardship to this unexpected hope.
And pull out the insights the source offers about faith, about providence.
Yeah, and how circumstances that feel incredibly bitter, just awful, can somehow lead to genuinely sweet outcomes.
So why should you care? Why listen to us talk about this ancient story told through poetry?
Because it speaks so powerfully to things we all wrestle with, right? Loss, loyalty, identity, and just the surprising ways hope can actually show up.
It really does. And it challenges how we might typically think about those things.
Okay, so where does the story begin according to this source? It starts in what the poem is called Bitter Providence.
Exactly. The poems open with aged Obed recounting the story to his grandson David, who's about 8 years old.
And David's playing his harp, already showing that musical gift he'd be famous for.
And he's curious, like kids are. He asks Obed about his great-grandma Ruth.
Right, he says she's kind of a local legend. People smile about her, sing songs.
There's even a play about her at harvest time. And David adds this little detail, with a child's honesty.
Ah, the part about the play.
Yeah, the kids aren't allowed because it has parts the daddy says are not for kids.
A little hint there, maybe, of the complexities in the story itself.
Could be. So Obed starts his story, and he lays down this foundational truth for him. All true stories, including this one, start with God.
And the source immediately gives us the context for that initial bitterness. God had stopped the rain. There was a severe famine gripping Israel, specifically Bethlehem, or Ephrathah, as it's called.
And Obed, as the narrator in these poems, he makes it very clear this famine wasn't just random bad luck. It was part of God's plan, a plan that specifically involved Ruth.
Which is pretty remarkable when you consider Ruth's background.
Totally. She's born a Moabite. And the source really emphasizes this. She was outside the law, outside the covenant, cut off from sacrifice from the priesthood.
Her gods are described as wood and stone, unable to cleanse her heart.
Yet, despite all that, the poems portray God having this definite plan. Not just to bring her to himself, but, incredibly, to give her royal seed.
So into this famine situation steps Elimelech, a man from Bethlehem.
Right. He takes his wife, Naomi, and they leave. They leave the land of God because of the famine.
And Obed's framing of this decision in the poems is quite pointed. He calls it an act of unbelief.
Yeah, the poems suggest Naomi felt they should have stayed, trusted God there. But Elimelech, facing the immediate hardship, he prioritized finding grain somewhere else, in Kemoth.
Over enduring the pain in Bethlehem, even if it meant staying in the land God promised.
Exactly. And Kemoth is depicted as, outside the promised land, a place of trade, maybe hinting at prioritizing worldly provision over that divine promise.
And the source suggests they went, unknowingly perhaps, towards judgment.
But also, paradoxically, on an errand of amazing grace and sovereign love. And the purpose of that errand?
To find Ruth.
To find Ruth. But the move quickly brings sorrow. Within about a year, Elimelech dies.
Then their sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they take Moabite wives, Orpah and Ruth.
And Obed frames this, too, in the poems as a rebel act, suggesting it broke the spirit of the law, maybe even mocked their mother Naomi's faith by marrying women from this forbidden lineage.
And the loss just keeps coming. Mahlon and Chilion also die.
Yeah, the poems include this detail. Obed mentions about them drowning while swimming in the Arnon River. It's portrayed as maybe an example of their youthful defiance, perhaps ignoring warnings or traditions.
Leaving Naomi utterly alone, bereft, just her 2 foreign daughters-in-law. It's a picture of absolute devastation.
Complete devastation. Which brings us to the second part of the story, focusing on Ruth's, well, radical commitment.
And what the source reveals about this idea of providence working through pain.
Right. So Naomi, just overwhelmed by loss, decides she has to return to Bethlehem. But the poems say she is expecting nothing but bitter memories there.
So she tells Orpah and Ruth, go back to your families, your own gods.
And Orpah makes the understandable choice, really. She leaves. But then there's Ruth.
Ruth's response. It's one of the most famous moments, and the poems really capture its power.
They do. She absolutely refuses to leave Naomi. Entreat me not, she says. And then comes that incredible vow.
She'll go where Naomi goes, live where she lives.
Take her path, even die where she dies, be buried in Israel. It's total commitment.
But here's where these poems bring out a really unique insight, I think. Ruth takes this commitment and she explicitly links it to her understanding of everything that's happened.
Yes, she declares there's a call upon my life. She looks back at those 10 long years of suffering, the famine, the deaths, being in a foreign land, and she sees that it was for them.
That is a striking interpretation the poem gives Ruth. She doesn't just endure the suffering, she actually interprets it.
Right. She says, generations yet to come through us will not forget to praise the bitter providence of God that wrought for us immense and precious mercies in this place and lavished me with painful grace.
Bitter providence, painful grace. I mean, that's not how we usually frame hardship, is it?
Not at all. The source frames Ruth as seeing the famine, the suffering, as the actual price that somehow opened paradise.
Like the pain itself was the pathway God used to bring her into his story, into his covenant.
And ultimately, as we know, into the lineage of the Messiah. It really challenges that common view that suffering is just something to get through, or maybe even evidence God isn't there.
Here, it's portrayed as an active, maybe even necessary part of his plan for grace.
And Ruth cements this whole radical commitment and faith with her declaration of identity. She says, I am Moabite to you, but more than that, your daughter too.
And then the absolute heart of it, I cleave to you, Naomi. I believe beneath this sweet and bitter rod that your great God will be my God.
Just wow. And Obed tells David he learned these truths, these exact words and ideas, from Ruth's own lullabies and ballads.
Which is such a powerful image, isn't it? How faith and understanding of providence get passed down through generations. And it connects right back to David's own future as a psalmist.
It shows the enduring legacy of her perspective. And the source kind of wraps this section with the hope that because of faith like hers, we can actually pray that bitter providence will turn sweet.
That famine and death will ultimately bring life.
Yeah.
Okay, so shifting back to Obed and David in the sort of present narrative of the poems, David's still wrestling a bit, right? With Naomi's initial focus on grief when he knows, from Obed's telling, that God was doing so much more behind the scenes.
And Obed addresses this really honestly, which I appreciate. He admits that sometimes creed can't keep up with the speed of pain.
That's a great line.
Isn't it? He explains that Naomi's faith wasn't gone, not rejected. It was just slower. He uses this wonderful metaphor, calls it tortoise faith.
Tortoise faith?
Yeah, saying it would eventually catch the bounding hare of pain. It might lag behind the immediate intensity of grief, but it would win the race in the end.
That's such a compassionate way to look at faith that's struggling under the weight of sorrow.
It really is.
And what was the turning point for Naomi, according to these poems?
Obed says simply, she prayed. That act, rooted in that slow, persistent tortoise faith, that was the catalyst.
And the poems then describe the barley field becoming this place of quiet power, where this race of faith was won for Naomi.
And it's here we properly meet Boaz, who is Obed's father. Obed reveals that Boaz conquered hate and loved a Moabite beneath the wings of God.
So by taking Ruth in, marrying her, Boaz actually did bequeath Naomi, thus more faith than she had ever known.
Exactly. He didn't just provide security, though that was huge. He demonstrated God's love and acceptance in action, and that rekindled Naomi's hope.
So Obed takes young David to visit Boaz, and Boaz is now extremely old, nearly 99, and he's blind.
Right. And David plays a song for him, the very one Boaz and Ruth apparently sang together for 63 years of marriage.
Wow. And Boaz recognizes the music.
Instantly. And then he recognizes David by touch, noting he feels like Ruth.
This really tender moment. And Boaz then recounts his side of the story, particularly the challenges he faced marrying Ruth, the Moabite. He makes it clear it wasn't easy, it wasn't just automatically accepted.
No, and the source really emphasizes his father's strong opposition. His father called Ruth a Moabite, said she had no name, was basically a slave.
And that marrying her would be a disgrace. He even dredged up her origins, linking her people back to Lot and his daughter, saying they were born in shame.
Yeah, he absolutely did not want Boaz to sacrifice the family name, the lineage, by raising seed from Elon, the deceased husband.
But Boaz, as he's portrayed here, has this powerful, really countercultural defense.
He does. He doesn't deny the difficult history of the Moabites, but he argues against judging Ruth based on the sins of her ancestors. He points out, look, if that's the standard, nobody's good.
And significantly, he turns the mirror back on Israel's own history.
Yes, he brings up Israel's own imperfect lineage, specifically mentioning the story of Tamar and Judah.
Which, if you're not familiar, is a pretty scandalous story involving what's portrayed as incest right within Israel's own founding family lines.
Exactly. So by referencing that controversial part of their own history, Boaz is basically saying it's hypocritical to judge Ruth solely by Moabite origins while ignoring Israel's own baggage.
He argues that what truly matters is Ruth's inner character and her faith, what he calls her sacred Jewish faith within, even though she was born a Moabite. He says this faith was greater than that of 1,000 Israelites.
It's powerful stuff.
Yeah.
He lists her virtues as the source presents them. Her love for God, her endurance having borne the biting rod, her selfless love for Naomi, her hard work gleaning in the fields, her purity.
And then he makes that profound declaration, this woman lives beneath the wings of God.
Yeah. And he tells his father, essentially, I'd rather share the shame of faith and love than save my name, choosing integrity and God's perceived will over reputation.
Wow. That's a huge statement about valuing faith and character above external identity, above reputation, and directly confronting that prejudice based on origin.
Absolutely. Which leads us nicely into the fourth part, the winnowing floor encounter, and how this faith gets put into action.
Right. So we're back in Obed's cart with old Boaz and young David riding towards the gleaning stand.
And the cart itself turns out to be significant. The poems explain Obed built it himself when he was just 10 years old.
For the poor gleaners.
Exactly. Apparently Ruth had taught him to interpret the Torah, the law, not just as a set of rules, but with compassion. She helped him see how the law actually encourages helping those in need, like helping them carry their harvested grain up the hill.
So building the cart was his way of putting that into practice, helping the poor see God's care for them, prompted by his mother's teaching.
Yeah, it shows that ripple effect of her influence. And Boaz lived this compassionate understanding of the law, too. The source describes him working right alongside his men, wearing the same clothes, even sifting grain with them.
And when someone questioned him doing that kind of labor?
He justified it by saying the Torah teaches loving your neighbor as yourself. And he believed it should be read to see as much compassion as we can. Find the compassion in the text.
That's a very different emphasis than just, say, strict rule following. It's about the heart of the law.
Definitely.
Right.
So Boaz takes David to a specific spot, under a cedar tree. This is the place where that famous winnowing floor encounter happened.
Okay, so he recounts the night he was winnowing late, fell asleep.
And was woken by something stirring at his feet. His first thought, as the poems describe it, was maybe a snake, or maybe some woman of the street who hopes to sell me love.
He even drew his knife, wary.
Yeah, but then realized it was human. He challenged them, but crucially stated he wouldn't touch a woman outside the covenant, adding almost to himself, though there is one I truly want.
And then he pulls back the covering.
And sees Ruth. She identifies herself and explains Naomi sent her, to lie at his feet as a sign that he was a kinsman redeemer, and to ask him to spread your holy wing and cover me.
She's echoing his own language about finding refuge under God's wings, asking him to be that refuge for her.
Precisely. And Boaz describes his internal reaction, his heart pounding. The poem says, crouching there was sin, awaiting one misstep. The temptation was real.
But he chooses the righteous path. He tells her there's actually a closer kinsman who has the first legal right.
Right. And he promises to resolve it properly, publicly, the very next day at the city gate. He makes it absolutely clear. No kiss that night.
As she leaves, though, she takes his hand. Boaz calls this their only touch before marriage.
Which connects back to David's childhood question about the touch in the play.
Ah, right.
She says something powerful. The God of Exodus and flood at dawn will fight for us. A statement of shared faith, trusting God to intervene.
So the next day, Boaz goes to the city gate, gathers the elders, gets the closer kinsmen there.
And he presents the case. Naomi's land is available for redemption, but the condition for getting the land is marrying Ruth, specifically to preserve Mahlon's name and inheritance line.
And the closer kinsman, he's interested in the land, right, says, it is very good.
He is. But when Boaz lays out the condition marrying Ruth, he refuses.
And his reason.
As portrayed in the poems, it's prejudice. She's a Moabite, he says it isn't right, and it would bring shame to his own name and inheritance. His fear of that shame tied to her origin outweighs the land and his duty.
So the deal is off for him. And the symbolic transfer happens. The kinsman takes off his sandal, gives it to Boaz.
Signifying he yields his right, and Boaz takes the sandal and, quite dramatically in the poem, throws it to Ruth, who's waiting in the crowd.
And then turns to her and declares, "What do you think of this, my bride?"
It's a great moment. And Ruth's response here, like her earlier vow, is incredibly insightful according to this source.
What did she say?
She affirms God fought for them, even using the kinsman's refusal, his sin of prejudice. She says that sin was stuck on the gate, but now their wedding date hangs there instead.
And regarding that whole badge of shame thing, her Moabite origin,
She boldly declares that the line of Judah bears it well, pointing right back to Israel's own messy, imperfect history and how God worked through it anyway.
and then comes her core theological insight, right? The key takeaway here.
Absolutely. She says, by faith, God makes a person right, be she a Jew or Moabite.
Wow.
The poem argues, through her voice, that the law's mercy, God's acceptance, it isn't limited by your external identity, your lineage, your origin. It's fundamentally about the heart of faith.
That's a powerful statement about inclusion, about God's economy.
It really is. And finally, Boaz sings his song, the O Barley Field song. He explains a line in it about losing someone to death refers to Mara, his first wife.
Okay.
He recounts Mara's faith during that earlier famine and how on her deathbed she actually prophesied about his future. A wedding feast, descendants, seed, and even a king being born in Bethlehem.
So this brings in another layer to the theme of waiting.
Exactly. Mara, by staying faithful in the land and dying there, played her part in God's plan. Maybe she kept Boaz from leaving like Elimelech did.
And Boaz himself waited 10 years after Mara died before he married Ruth.
Right. Obed emphasizes this waiting is holy work of faith. The source suggests God doesn't always take the quickest route, does he? He makes space for faith to grow, even for doubts to be wrestled with. He acts in his perfect timing, which might take years.
And different people serve differently in that waiting. Some, like Mara, serve by accepting their difficult path.
And others, like Ruth, serve by embracing a completely new, unexpected one. It shows the diverse ways faithfulness works within God's big plan.
So, wrapping up our deep dive into this poetic retelling of Ruth, the source material just vividly shows us how God's sovereign providence is, like intricately woven through everything, through personal tragedies, famine, death, being a foreigner, facing prejudice.
And through human choices, too. Really crucial human choices, both the negative ones, like unbelief or rebellion.
And the positive ones, like that profound faith we see in Ruth and the compassion in Boaz.
Right. All these elements somehow work together to bring about God's ultimate purposes, which in this story leads to this incredible lineage of blessing, culminating in King David himself.
The source really highlights the transformative power of faith. The faith of Ruth, Boaz, even Mara in her own way. It demonstrates that trusting God, especially through those bitter times, that's what truly matters. That's what defines a person, much more than their origin or any external label.
And you see the tangible impact of compassion that's rooted in that faith. Ruth's understanding of the Torah shapes Obed, leads him to build that cart.
And Boaz's practice in the field, his whole approach, comes from his deep conviction that the law should be read looking for as much compassion as we can.
Yeah. So the core journey here, as presented in these poems, it's from bitter providence to a sweet outcome, from famine to feast. And it's driven by God's plan, yes, but also by the faithful response of individuals within that plan.
And this faithfulness, this lineage, it ultimately produces a king, fulfilling God's promises in unexpected ways.
And this ancient story, told through this specific poetic lens, it really invites us to ask ourselves some questions, doesn't it?
Like, how can we, drawing insights from Ruth and Boaz as they're portrayed here, how can we learn to see God's hand working even in the difficult, the painful, the seemingly bitter parts of our own lives?
Yeah, and how does our faith, maybe shaped a bit by this source material, how does it define our identity? And how does it inform our actions, particularly when it comes to showing compassion, navigating differences in background or perspective?
It really challenges us, I think, to look beyond those external appearances, beyond lineage, to what's truly at the heart of how God makes a person right.
Absolutely. Which leads to maybe one final thought for you to chew on. If, as Ruth declared in these poems, faith, not origin, is what truly makes a person right in God's eyes, what does that mean for how we view and interact with everyone around us today?
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Pages to Dialogues. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and found valuable insights to apply to your life. If you did, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel, Pages to Dialogues, for more thought-provoking dialogues on Christian books.